What would you do if your billionaire husband served up your deepest memories for public humiliation? When Sarah Sterling placed her grandmother's chicken and dumplings before New York's elite, she thought she was sharing love on a plate. Instead, her husband turned her most precious recipe into a weapon of shame, calling it trailer park trash in front of senators and socialites. But here's what he didn't expect. Sometimes breaking someone completely is exactly what they need to discover their true strength. This is the story of how a woman lost everything and found herself with a Michelin star. You won't believe how this ends. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble dining table as Sarah Michelle Sterling placed the final bowl of her grandmother's chicken and dumplings before the last guest. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped back, watching New York's elite examine her offering with the detached curiosity of museum patrons. Well, Victor Sterling's voice cut through the polite murmur like a blade. Sarah's husband rose from his seat at the head of the table, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow over the entire room. Ladies and gentlemen, my wife has decided to treat us to an authentic taste of her origins tonight. The word origins dripped with such disdain that Sarah felt her cheeks burn. Around the table sat senators, tech moguls, and socialites whose combined net worth could fund small countries. Victoria Ashworth, the mayor's wife, raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Senator James Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This, Victor continued, lifting his spoon with theatrical precision, is what they call comfort food in East Texas trailer parks. Very rustic. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She had spent 3 days perfecting this recipe, the same one that had fed her and her grandmother through the hardest years after her parents died in that car crash when she was 12. The same recipe that had brought comfort to truckers and factory workers at Mima's Diner, where Sarah had waitressed until Victor swept into her life like a tornado in a $1,000 suit. Victor took a small, deliberate bite. The table fell silent, waiting for his verdict like courtiers before a king. He placed his spoon down with a metallic clink that echoed through the cavernous penthouse. Fascinating, he said, turning not to Sarah but to his audience. My wife thinks she can elevate us with peasant food. Tell me, darling. He addressed Sarah directly for the first time, his voice syrupy with false affection. What's next? Are we serving moonshine in mason jars? The laughter that erupted was sharp and cruel. It wasn't the warm chuckle of appreciation, but the vicious cackle of pack animals who had sensed weakness. Victoria Ashworth tittered behind her manicured fingers. Senator Rodriguez's laugh was uncomfortably loud, as if trying to prove his allegiance to his host. Victor, please, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the mocking sounds. Please what? Victor's blue eyes, once so charming during their whirlwind courtship, now glittered with malice. Please pretend this slop belongs on the same table as our guests. Please act like trailer park trash can somehow become sophisticated through marriage. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She stood frozen as the laughter continued, each burst of sound stripping away another layer of her dignity. These were the same people who smiled at her at charity galas, who complimented her dresses, who called her lovely. Now she saw the truth in their eyes. She was Victor's amusing mistake. His temporary lapse in judgment made flesh. I think, Victor continued, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms, we should stick to what we know works. Leave the cooking to the professionals and leave the trailer park where it belongs. In the past, Sarah wanted the marble floor to open and swallow her whole. The dish that represented everything she held dear, her grandmother's love, her childhood memories, her authentic self, had been served up for public ridicule. It wasn't just about the food. Victor had taken the most genuine part of her and declared it worthless, embarrassing, beneath notice. As the guests returned to their conversations, discussing stock options and vacation homes as if nothing had happened, Sarah remained standing beside the table like a statue. The only person not laughing was Maria Santos, the housekeeper who had witnessed the entire spectacle from the kitchen doorway. Their eyes met across the room, and Sarah saw something she rarely encountered any more genuine sympathy. The evening dragged on with excruciating slowness. Sarah played her role perfectly, the smiling, silent wife who nodded at the right moments and laughed at unfunny jokes. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The golden cage that had once felt luxurious now felt suffocating. When the last guest finally departed, leaving trails of expensive perfume and hollow goodbyes, the silence that descended felt more oppressive than the earlier humiliation. Victor loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of 30-year-old scotch, the amber liquid catching the light from the city spread out below their 57th floor windows. "Well," he said, turning to Sarah with the air of a benevolent king addressing a wayward subject, "that could have been worse. I think I managed to smooth things over." Sarah stared at him, this man she had once thought she loved, and realized she was looking at a stranger. No, worse than a stranger. She was looking at her captor, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, she was ready to admit it. Sarah Michelle Crawford, she still thought of herself by her maiden name in quiet moments, had not always been a trophy wife living in a Manhattan penthouse. The transformation from small-town Texas waitress to billionaire's spouse felt like a fever dream that had somehow become her waking reality. She grew up in Longview, Texas, population 43,000 on a good day. Her parents, both teachers at the local high school, died in a car accident during her senior year, leaving 17-year-old Sarah with nothing but a mortgage on a double-wide trailer and her grandmother, Meemaw, who was already showing signs of the dementia that would claim her 3 years later. Meemaw's diner became Sarah's lifeline. The grease-stained establishment sat on the edge of town, serving truckers, oil field workers, and anyone else who needed a hot meal and didn't mind the occasional curse word floating from the kitchen. Sarah worked every shift she could, learning to balance plates on her arms while dodging wandering hands and perfecting the art of the customer smile. Bright enough to encourage tips, distant enough to discourage advances. The diner was where she learned about real food, not the molecular gastronomy nonsense that filled Victor's world. Meemaw's recipes were born of necessity and loved chicken and dumplings that could feed a family of 6 for under $10. Cornbread that soaked up the last drops of whatever was in your bowl, and peach cobbler that made grown men weep. "Food is love made visible," Meemaw used to say, her arthritic hands still steady as she rolled out biscuit dough. "Don't matter if you got fancy ingredients or just what's in the pantry. You cook with your heart, and people will taste it." Victor Sterling walked into Meemaw's diner on a Tuesday in March, looking as out of place as a peacock in a chicken coop. His driver had gotten lost trying to find the interstate, and Victor needed directions and coffee. Sarah remembered every detail of that first encounter, his charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. The way he looked around the diner, like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. The surprised expression when he tasted her grandmother's apple pie. "This is exceptional," he told her, his voice carrying the crisp authority of elite education. "Who's your chef?" "That would be my Meemaw," Sarah replied, refilling his coffee cup. 92 years old and still the best cook in East Texas. What followed was a courtship so intense it left Sarah breathless. Private jets to New York for weekend dates, jewelry that cost more than her trailer, dinners at restaurants where the waiters wore tuxedos, and the wine list read like a foreign language. Victor presented her with a world she had only seen in movies. And for a 23-year-old girl who had never been further than Dallas, it was intoxicating. "You're wasted in that place," Victor told her during their third date, as they sat in his corporate jet 30,000 feet above the Texas plains. "You have natural grace, natural beauty. I could show you things you've never dreamed of." The proposal came 6 weeks later, with a ring that made her dizzy and promises of a life beyond her wildest imagination. Sarah said yes, caught up in the fairy tale narrative of the poor girl who caught the prince's eye. She was too young and too dazzled to see the warning signs, how Victor never asked about her opinions, how he spoke about their future as if she were a beautiful accessory to be displayed rather than a partner to be consulted. The wedding was a society event covered by 3 magazines. Sarah wore a dress that cost more than the diner's annual revenue and smiled for photographers while feeling like she was floating outside her own body. Meemaw, in the early stages of her decline, kept asking who all these fancy people were and when they could go home. Moving to New York was like moving to another planet. The penthouse occupied the entire 57th floor of a building where apartments started at $8 million. Everything was white marble and glass, beautiful and cold and utterly without personality. Sarah's few possessions from Texas, her grandmother's recipe box, a quilt Meemaw had made, photographs from the diner, looked shabby and out of place in the sterile perfection. Victor's world operated by rules Sarah didn't understand. There were charity boards she was expected to join, social events where her primary function was to look beautiful and say as little as possible, and an endless parade of stylists, trainers, and consultants whose job was to mold her into the perfect billionaire's wife. We need to work on your accent. Victor's etiquette coach, a severe woman named Mrs. On Patterson, informed her during their first session. And your vocabulary, and your posture. Really, dear, we're starting from scratch. The isolation crept in slowly. Sarah's friends from Texas couldn't relate to her new life, and the women in Victor's circle accepted her with the frosty politeness reserved for interlopers. She spent her days in appointments designed to improve her appearance and her evenings at events where she was expected to smile and nod, while Victor discussed business with people who talked about millions like she once talked about tips. The only person who treated her like a human being was Maria Santos, the housekeeper who had worked for Victor for 8 years. Maria was from El Salvador, had raised 4 children while sending money home to her elderly parents, and possessed the kind of strength that came from surviving genuine hardship. He wasn't always like this, Maria told Sarah one afternoon as they sat in the kitchen, the only room in the penthouse that felt remotely warm. When he was younger, before his parents died and left him all that money, he was different, kinder. Money changes people. Mija. Makes them forget what's real. Sarah wanted to believe Maria's words, wanted to think that somewhere inside her husband was the charming man who had swept her off her feet. But as the months turned into years, that man seemed more and more like a fiction. Victor controlled every aspect of her life, her schedule, her wardrobe, her social interactions. He monitored their joint accounts and questioned every expense. The prenuptial agreement she had signed, trusting and naive, left her with nothing if they divorced. "You're my wife," Victor reminded her whenever she showed signs of independence. "That's a full-time job. I provide everything you could possibly need. Everything except respect. Everything except love. Everything except the feeling that she was more than an expensive decoration in his carefully curated life." The dinner party disaster was just the final confirmation of what Sarah had been slowly realizing: she wasn't Victor's wife. She was his prisoner. And the penthouse wasn't a palace, it was a cage made of gold and glass, and she was suffocating inside it. 3 days after the dinner party humiliation, Sarah sat in her walk-in closet surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of designer clothes that felt like costumes for a play she no longer wanted to perform in. Her phone buzzed with messages from other society wives expressing their concern, each text message a thinly veiled request for gossip about her marriage troubles. Maria knocked softly on the closet door. "Senora Sarah, you have been in here for 2 hours. Maybe you eat something." Sarah emerged, her eyes red from crying. Maria took one look at her and closed the closet door behind them, creating a small cocoon of privacy in the vast bedroom. "He's destroyed me." "Maria," Sarah whispered. "Completely. Everyone was laughing at me. And he enjoyed it. He planned it." Maria's weathered hands cupped Sarah's face with surprising gentleness. "Listen to me, mija. I have been cleaning up rich men's messes for 20 years. I know what real strength looks like, and it's not what you see in that boardroom. It's what I see in you right now. I'm trapped. The prenup, the money, everything. If I leave, I have nothing. Nothing." Maria's eyes flashed with something fierce. "You think nothing is worse than this? I came to this country with nothing. My sister Rosa. She left her husband with nothing but the clothes on her back and 4 children under 10. Nothing is freedom, mija. Nothing is possibility." That evening, while Victor attended another business dinner, Maria led Sarah down a service elevator she didn't know existed, through basement corridors that smelled of industrial cleaning supplies and forgotten dreams. They emerged in a loading dock where a beat-up Honda Civic waited with its engine running. "This is my daughter Carmen," Maria said, introducing a young woman with kind eyes and calloused hands. "She knows people who help women like you, but only if you're serious about helping yourself." Carmen drove them through neighborhoods Sarah had never seen despite living in New York for 3 years. They passed bodegas with hand-painted signs, apartment buildings where laundry hung from fire escapes like colorful flags, and streets where Spanish and English mixed in a linguistic dance that felt more vibrant than anything in her sterile penthouse world. They stopped at a community center in Queens, a squat brick building that housed what Carmen called the network, an underground railroad for women escaping abusive relationships. Sarah met Elena Rodriguez, a social worker who had left her own marriage with nothing but a law degree and determination to help other women do the same. The first thing you need to understand, Elena told Sarah in a cramped office decorated with children's drawings and motivational posters, is that leaving isn't about one dramatic moment. It's about building a foundation for independence, one brick at a time. Elena introduced Sarah to other women: a former surgeon whose husband had controlled her medical license, a teacher whose ex-husband had stalked her across 3 states, a chef whose restaurant owner husband had erased her contributions from their shared business. Each woman's story was different, but they all shared the same underlying theme: the slow erosion of identity, the gradual loss of self that came from being with someone who saw them as possessions rather than people. "You think you're weak because you stayed," said Monica, a former banker who now ran a food truck and looked happier than anyone Sarah had seen in months. "But staying in an impossible situation takes incredible strength. The question is, are you ready to use that strength differently?" The women didn't judge Sarah for her privilege or suggest that her problems weren't real because she lived in luxury. They understood that abuse came in many forms, and that emotional and psychological violence could be just as devastating as physical brutality. "Your husband uses money as a weapon," Elena explained. "Classic financial abuse. He's isolated you from your support systems, made you financially dependent, and used public humiliation to destroy your confidence. The goal is to make you believe you can't survive without him." Over the following weeks, Sarah began attending support group meetings in that community center basement. She learned practical skills: how to hide small amounts of cash, how to create documentation of abusive behavior, how to research job opportunities without leaving digital traces that Victor could monitor. But more importantly, she began to remember who she had been before she became Mrs. Victor Sterling. The women in the group saw through her designer clothes and perfect makeup to the scared but determined girl from East Texas who had once balanced 5 plates on each arm while memorizing orders for a 12-top table. "You mentioned you used to cook," said Janet, a former marketing executive who now owned a catering company. "Real cooking, not just heating up takeout. That's a skill. Honey, that's something no one can take away from you." The seed of an idea began to germinate in Sarah's mind. She remembered the satisfaction of seeing truckers' faces light up when they tasted Mima's cornbread. She remembered the pride in her grandmother's voice when regular customers requested Sarah's apple pie specifically. She remembered feeling useful, valuable, necessary. "There's a guy," Carmen mentioned during one of their drives back to Manhattan, "Jake Morrison. He runs an underground supper club, feeds working folks who can't afford fancy restaurants but deserve good food. He's always looking for help, but he doesn't trust easy. Had some rich people try to slum it before, treating his place like a zoo exhibit." Sarah felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine curiosity about another person's world, rather than dread about being judged by it. "Could you introduce me?" she asked. Carmen studied her carefully. "He won't care about your fancy clothes or your husband's money. If anything, that'll count against you. You'll need to prove you're serious about the work, not just playing dress up." "I'm serious," Sarah said, and for the first time in months, she meant it completely. "I need to remember who I am, and I think the kitchen might be where I find her." The plan began to take shape. Sarah would use her charity work as cover. Victor barely paid attention to her volunteer activities as long as they reflected well on his image. She would begin by helping at the supper club, learning skills she could use to support herself if she ever found the courage to leave. It wasn't escape yet, but it was preparation. And for a woman who had felt powerless for 3 years, preparation felt like rebellion. "One brick at a time," Elena reminded her as they planned Sarah's first visit to Jake's operation. "You're not building a wall, mija. You're building a bridge to the life you actually want to live." The address Carmen had given Sarah led to a narrow alley behind an auto repair shop in Long Island City. The smell of motor oil mixed with something that made her stomach growl: garlic, onions, and the rich aroma of slow-cooked meat. Sarah checked her phone 3 times, certain she was in the wrong place, before spotting a small hand-painted sign that read, "Jake's Joint, good food, good people." The entrance was nothing more than a steel door with scratch paint and an intercom system that looked like it had been installed during the Carter administration. Sarah pressed the button and waited. Yeah, the voice was gravelly, unimpressed. Carmen Rodriguez sent me, about helping with the cooking. A long pause. You, Sarah? Yes. You alone? Yes. The door buzzed open, revealing a steep staircase that led down into what had once been the repair shop's basement. The space had been transformed into something between a restaurant and a community center. Mismatched tables and chairs filled the main area, while an open kitchen took up the entire back wall. The lighting was warm but functional, the kind of place where you came for the food and company, not Instagram photos. Jake Morrison stood behind the main prep station, a man who looked to be in his late 30s with forearms like tree trunks and hands that moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been cooking professionally for decades. He was attractive in a way that was completely different from Victor's polished perfection. Jake looked like he had earned every line on his face and every scar on his hands. So you're the rich lady who wants to play chef, he said without looking up from the vegetables he was dicing. His knife work was hypnotic, perfect brunoise cuts that would have impressed the instructors at the Culinary Institute of America. I'm not playing, Sarah said, stung by his dismissive tone. Yeah, what's your experience? I worked in my grandmother's diner for 6 years. Prep cook, line cook, expo, front of house, everything except the books. Jake finally looked up, his dark eyes assessing her with the same intensity he might use to judge whether a sauce needed more salt. Texas, East Texas, Longview, truck stop food, working people food, Sarah corrected, her spine straightening. Good food, honest food. Something shifted in Jake's expression. He wiped his hands on his apron and walked around the prep station to study her more closely. Sarah resisted the urge to fidget under his scrutiny. Strip off the jewelry, he said finally. Excuse me. You want to work in my kitchen? You follow my rules. No jewelry except a wedding ring. Tie your hair back. Wash your hands properly. I mean, really wash them. Not whatever you do at those charity lunches. Sarah removed her watch, earrings, and bracelets, stacking them carefully on the metal shelf beside the hand sink. She pulled her blonde hair into a tight ponytail and scrubbed her hands with the industrial soap until they were red. Better? Jake handed her a knife, not an expensive German blade like the ones in Victor's showpiece kitchen, but a well-maintained workhorse with a handle worn smooth by thousands of hours of use. Show me your knife skills. He placed a pile of onions in front of her. Sarah picked up the first one, made a shallow cut to remove the skin, and began to dice. Her movements were rusty at first. It had been almost 4 years since she'd done this kind of work, but muscle memory kicked in. The rhythm came back: rock, chop, rock, chop. The satisfying thunk of steel against cutting board. Not terrible, Jake admitted after she'd worked through half the pile. Your brunoise is uneven, but that's fixable. Why do you want to do this? Sarah paused, the knife midway through another onion. The honest answer was complicated. Escape, identity, rebellion, survival. But she sensed that Jake would see through anything less than the truth. Because I forgot who I was, she said simply. And I think I left her in a kitchen somewhere. Jake studied her for a long moment, then nodded toward the stove. Service starts in 3 hours. We're expecting 60 covers tonight. You can work prep until 7. Then we'll see if you can handle the line. You screw up an order. You're gone. You cause drama with my staff. You're gone. You bring any of your uptown problems into my kitchen. You're gone. Clear. Clear. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of chopped vegetables, stirred sauces, and prep work that left Sarah's feet aching and her arms sore. Jake's staff was small but efficient. Rosa handled pantry and cold apps. Tommy worked the grill, and Jake expedited while cooking the more complex dishes. They accepted Sarah's presence with cautious neutrality, willing to let her prove herself but not particularly invested in her success. The dinner rush was controlled chaos. Orders came in steadily from the dining room, where working-class families, young couples, and shift workers filled every table. The prices were reasonable, the portions generous, and the food was exactly what Sarah remembered from her grandmother's diner: uncomplicated, well executed, satisfying. Fire 2 meatloaf, 1 chicken parm, 3 mac and cheese, Jake called out, his voice cutting through the sizzle and clatter of the busy kitchen. Sarah found herself on salad station, a position that required speed and consistency, but wasn't complex enough to derail service if she made mistakes. She plated mixed greens with Jake's signature vinaigrette, added perfectly diced vegetables and croutons, and sent them out to the pass where Jake inspected every dish before it left the kitchen. "Better," he said after the third salad met his standards. "Faster." By the time the last order went out, Sarah's shirt was soaked with sweat, and her feet felt like she'd been walking on concrete for hours, which she had. But underneath the exhaustion was something she hadn't felt in years, the satisfaction of honest work, of contributing to something larger than herself, of being useful rather than ornamental. "Not bad for a society wife," Jake said as they cleaned down the kitchen. "You remember more than I thought you would." "It's like riding a bicycle," Sarah said, wiping down her cutting board for the third time. "Except the bicycle is trying to kill you and everyone's watching." Jake actually smiled at that, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him all evening. "You want to come back tomorrow?" "Yes. Same time." "And Sarah?" He waited until she looked at him. "Whatever's going on in your life uptown, it stays uptown. This place is about the food and the people we serve. It's not therapy, and I'm not your savior." "We clear on that, my work clear." Walking back to the subway station, Sarah felt more alive than she had in months. Her hands smelled like garlic and her back ached. But for the first time since moving to New York, she had spent an evening being genuinely useful. She had contributed to something that mattered, feeding people who worked hard for their money and deserved a good meal at the end of a long day. The contrast with her usual evenings, charity dinners where she sat silently while Victor networked, gallery openings where she smiled and nodded at conversations about art she didn't understand, society events where her primary function was to look beautiful, was stark. As the subway carried her back toward Manhattan, Sarah began to formulate a plan. She would continue working at Jake's place, learning everything she could about running a real kitchen. She would build skills, confidence, and connections that existed entirely outside Victor's world. And when she was ready, when she had saved enough money and developed enough expertise to survive on her own, she would walk away from the golden cage forever. It was a long-term plan, one that would require patience and careful execution. But for the first time since her wedding day, Sarah felt like she was moving towards something rather than running away from it. The train pulled into her station, and Sarah climbed the stairs back to street level, back to the world of marble and glass and careful pretense. But now she carried with her the smell of honest work and the knowledge that somewhere in the city, there was a place where she was valued for what she could do rather than how she looked doing it. 2 weeks into her secret life at Jake's joint, Sarah had fallen into a routine that felt more natural than anything she'd done since leaving Texas. She would attend her required society functions, charity luncheons, museum board meetings, dinner parties where she smiled and nodded while Victor's business associates discussed deals worth more than most people made in a lifetime. Then escaped to Queens where she chopped vegetables, learned sauce techniques, and remembered what it felt like to be useful. Jake was a demanding teacher, quick to criticism and slow to praise, but Sarah found herself thriving under his no-nonsense approach. He had grown up in Brooklyn, the son of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. His culinary education had come from the streets rather than school's prep work in neighborhood restaurants, line cooking in diners, gradually working his way up through kitchens where mistakes meant getting fired and excellence meant getting a chance to learn something new. "Cooking isn't about being fancy," Jake told her one evening as she struggled with his technique for pan-searing chicken. "It's about understanding heat, timing, and respect for your ingredients. The rest is just showing off." Sarah was finding her rhythm on the line, her knife skills improving daily, when Rebecca Sterling appeared at Jake's joint like a viper in an evening gown. Rebecca was Victor's younger sister, a woman who had inherited all of the family's wealth and none of its business sense. She compensated for her lack of professional achievement by becoming a professional social climber, the kind of person who knew everyone worth knowing and considered gossip a competitive sport. Sarah had always found Rebecca exhausting but harmless, until the night she walked into the underground restaurant with a smirk that made Sarah's blood run cold. "My dear sister-in-law," Rebecca announced, her voice carrying clearly over the dinner conversation. "How absolutely bohemian of you." The dining room fell silent. Sarah froze at her prep station, a half-diced onion forgotten under her knife. Through the pass window, she could see Rebecca standing in the entrance, surveying the simple space with the air of an anthropologist discovering a new tribe. Jake appeared at Sarah's shoulder, his voice low and dangerous. "Friend of yours." "Sister-in-law," Sarah whispered. "I can explain." "No need." Jake's expression had gone completely cold. "Go handle your family drama outside my restaurant." Sarah untied her apron with trembling hands and walked into the dining room, acutely aware that every eye was on her. Rebecca's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Darling, you look so authentic in that little outfit," Rebecca said, taking in Sarah's kitchen clothes and ponytail. "Very working class. I'm sure Victor will find it charming when I tell him where his wife spends her evenings." "What do you want?" "Rebecca, I want to help you, of course. You're clearly going through some sort of crisis, perfectly understandable, married to my brother, and family should stick together." Rebecca's offer came the next day over lunch at the kind of restaurant where the waiters wore white gloves and the menu had no prices. She presented herself as Sarah's ally, understanding and supportive of her need for creative expression. "I've been thinking about your little cooking hobby," Rebecca said over their second bottle of wine. "It's actually quite inspired, very authentic, very real, the kind of thing that could really resonate with people." Sarah should have known better, should have recognized the predatory gleam in Rebecca's eyes, the same look Victor got when he was about to close a particularly lucrative deal. But she was desperate for an ally, someone in Victor's family who might understand her need for independence. "I could help you," Rebecca continued. "I know investors, restaurant people. We could turn this into something legitimate, a real business, not just whatever it is you're doing in that basement." The proposal seemed too good to be true. Rebecca would provide startup capital and business connections while Sarah contributed her culinary skills and authentic story. They would open a small restaurant in an up-and-coming neighborhood, something that bridged the gap between Jake's underground operation and the stuffy establishments that filled Victor's world. "Think of it as liberation through capitalism," Rebecca said with a laugh that should have served as a warning. "You get your independence. I get to be the cool sister-in-law who discovered the next big thing. Everyone wins." Sarah wanted to believe it was possible, wanted to think that she could build a bridge between her two worlds without burning either one down. She signed the partnership papers Rebecca presented, documents that seemed straightforward enough: 50-50 ownership, shared decision-making, equal investment of time and money. She should have read them more carefully, should have insisted on her own lawyer rather than trusting Rebecca's assurances that family doesn't need all that legal nonsense, should have recognized that a woman who had never worked a day in her life might not understand the concept of equal partnership. The betrayal revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. First, Sarah discovered that the restaurant location Rebecca had secured was in Rebecca's name only. Then she learned that the business license listed Rebecca as the sole proprietor. Finally, when she tried to access the joint bank account they had supposedly established, she found that her name wasn't on it. "Oh, that," Rebecca said when confronted, her voice dripping with false innocence. "My lawyers suggested it would be cleaner this way. Tax purposes. You understand? You'll still be the chef. Of course, the talent. I'll handle the boring business side." The truth crystallized with horrible clarity. Rebecca had never intended to create a partnership. She had seen an opportunity to steal Sarah's work, her recipes, her story, and turn them into something she could own and control. Sarah would be an employee in her own restaurant, dependent on Rebecca's goodwill for her livelihood. "You can't do this," Sarah said, her voice shaking with fury. "Can't I?" Rebecca's mask slipped completely, revealing the calculating coldness beneath. "What are you going to do? Sue me with what money? What lawyer face it? Darling, you're not equipped for this world. You're a diner waitress playing dress-up. I'm offering you the chance to do what you love under my protection. Most people would be grateful." The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. Sarah had learned not to trust the Sterling family's promises. The worst part was returning to Jake's joint to find that her reputation there had been irreparably damaged. Word of her association with Rebecca had spread through the tight-knit community of restaurant workers, painting Sarah as another rich dilettante slumming it for entertainment. I told you no uptown drama, Jake said when she tried to explain. His disappointment was worse than anger would have been. You brought exactly the kind of person I spend my life avoiding into my space, into my worker's space. She's not me. Isn't she? You're all the same. You people think you can buy authenticity, own other people's stories. Jake shook his head. I was starting to think you were different. My mistake. The ban from Jake's joint was unofficial, but absolute. Sarah could have forced her way back in. Jake couldn't legally prevent her from entering a public establishment, but she understood that her presence would only make things harder for him and his staff. She had contaminated the one place that had felt like home, brought the poison of her uptown life into the only space that had offered genuine refuge. Sitting in her penthouse that night, surrounded by luxury that felt more like a prison than ever. Sarah realized that Rebecca's betrayal was just a symptom of a larger truth she couldn't escape Victor's world by trying to straddle both sides. The golden cage was mobile, following her wherever she went, turning everything she touched into another avenue for control and manipulation. But Rebecca had made one crucial mistake. In her eagerness to steal Sarah's work, she had shown her hand too early. Sarah now understood exactly how the game was played in Victor's world, and she was ready to learn the rules well enough to beat them at it. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The photograph arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the penthouse door like a poison letter. Sarah found it when she returned from what had become a pointless daily walk around Central Park. Her only excuse to leave the apartment now that Jake's joint was closed to her, and Rebecca had stolen her restaurant dreams. The image was grainy, clearly taken with a long lens camera from across the street, but the subjects were unmistakable. Sarah entering Jake's joint, Sarah in an apron behind the prep station, Sarah laughing at something Rosa had said during a brief break in service. Someone had been watching her, documenting her secret life, building a case against her. Victor was waiting in his study when she found him. The photograph spread across his mahogany desk like evidence in a criminal trial. His face was calm, which Sarah had learned was infinitely more dangerous than anger. Sit down, he said without looking up from his computer. Sarah remained standing. Some instinct told her that sitting would be surrendering, accepting whatever judgment he was about to deliver. I said sit. This time his voice carried the steel that made corporate executives tremble in boardrooms. Sarah sat. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Victor's tone was conversational, almost curious. Did you imagine that you could sneak around my city, embarrassing my name, without consequences? I wasn't embarrassing. You were working as a minimum wage line cook in a basement restaurant that probably violates half a dozen health codes. My wife, serving food to truckers and construction workers like some common waitress. The word common hit like a slap. It was Victor's ultimate insult, the weapon he used whenever he wanted to remind Sarah of the vast gulf between her origins and his elevated world. That restaurant serves honest food to honest people, Sarah said, finding her voice. There's nothing shameful about that work. Everything is shameful about that work. For you, for my wife. Victor stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed his kingdom 57 floors below. Do you understand what you cost me? The Sterling name carries weight in this city. It opens doors, secures deals, commands respect, and you've been dragging it through the gutter for your little culinary adventure. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. How long have you known? Months. I've had investigators watching you since the night you humiliated me at the dinner party. Did you think I would simply accept that level of disrespect without taking action? The betrayal was complete and systematic. Victor had known about Jake's joint, about her friendship with Maria, about the support group meetings in Queens. He had watched her rebuild her confidence and sense of self, had allowed her to believe she was creating something independent, all while gathering evidence to destroy it. Rebecca, Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. The restaurant scheme. You knew about that too. Victor's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Rebecca's business ventures have always been ambitious beyond her capabilities. I simply suggested she might find a partner whose skills complemented her investment capital. The trap had been elaborate and patient. Victor had used his own sister to steal Sarah's work, knowing that the betrayal would drive her back into isolation. He had allowed Sarah to think she was building independence while actually orchestrating her dependence more thoroughly than ever. The photographs, Victor continued, returning to his desk and spreading out additional images Sarah hadn't noticed before, are just the beginning. I have financial records showing that you've been hiding money from our joint accounts. I have witness statements from restaurant staff who observed your erratic behavior, your drinking during work hours. Sarah stared at the fabricated evidence. The photographs were real, but the financial records were doctored and the witness statements were lies. It didn't matter. In Victor's world, perception was reality, and he had crafted a narrative that painted her as an unstable woman, having a public breakdown. The prenuptial agreement you signed, Victor said, pulling out a thick legal document, includes a morality clause. Conduct unbecoming to the Sterling name, public embarrassment, behavior that reflects poorly on the family reputation. Any of these provide grounds for immediate divorce with no financial settlement. Sarah's hands were shaking as the full scope of her situation became clear. Victor hadn't just discovered her secret life. He had weaponized it. The very attempt to build independence had been turned into evidence of instability, grounds for cutting her off completely from any financial support. However, Victor continued, his voice taking on the magnanimous tone he used when offering mercy to defeated business rivals, I'm prepared to be generous. This has obviously been a difficult period for you, adjusting to married life, dealing with the pressure of our social obligations. I'm willing to overlook this episode as a temporary lapse in judgment. The offer was presented like a gift. Victor would destroy the evidence, call off the investigators, allow Sarah to return to her role as the perfect society wife. All she had to do was abandon any pretense of independence, accept his complete control, and never again attempt to build anything that belonged to her rather than him. I need time to think, Sarah said. You have until tomorrow morning. Sign the new agreement, a more restrictive version of our prenup that explicitly forbids this kind of behavior, or I file for divorce and make sure you leave with nothing. Nothing. Sarah, no money, no reputation, no references for future employment. I'll make sure no restaurant in this city will hire you to wash dishes, let alone cook. That night, Sarah sat in her walk-in closet surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of designer clothes and felt more trapped than she ever had in Mima's double-wide trailer. The poverty of her childhood had been limiting, but it had been honest. This luxury was a beautiful lie, and the price of maintaining it was her soul. Maria found her there at midnight, still wearing the same clothes from morning, staring at the wall of shoes like they might offer some solution to her dilemma. Mija, Maria said softly, sitting on the carpeted floor beside her. Whatever he's done, whatever he's threatened, it's not the end. Sarah told her everything: the photographs, the fabricated evidence, the ultimatum. Maria listened without interruption, her face growing darker with each detail. He's done this before? Maria said when Sarah finished. Not exactly this, but similar. There was another woman, before you, Isabella. She tried to leave him too. What happened to her? She signed his papers, stayed married for 2 more years before she finally couldn't take it anymore. When she left, she had to move back in with her parents in Chicago. Couldn't find work, couldn't get references. Last I heard, she was cleaning houses for minimum wage. The message was clear: Victor's threats weren't empty. He had the power and connections to destroy anyone who challenged his control. Sarah could fight him and lose everything, or she could surrender and lose herself. There's a third option, Maria said quietly, but it's the hardest one. What? You disappear, completely, new name, new city, new life. Leave everything behind and start over with nothing but what you can carry. Sarah thought about Jake's words sometimes. You have to lose everything to find out what actually matters. The prospect of walking away from her marriage with literally nothing was terrifying. But the prospect of staying, of signing Victor's new agreement and accepting complete captivity, was worse. How would I even do that? Maria smiled for the first time all evening. Mija, you think you're the first woman who ever needed to disappear from a man like this? The network? It doesn't just help women leave. Sometimes it helps them vanish. For the first time in months, Sarah felt a spark of something that might have been hope. It wasn't a good option. There were no good options when dealing with someone like Victor, but it was a choice, and choice, even a desperate one, was better than the beautiful prison he was offering. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. She would rather be poor and free than rich and captive. She would rather start over with nothing than surrender what remained of herself to maintain the illusion of having everything. "Tell me about disappearing," Sarah said. The plan required 3 weeks of careful preparation and the kind of patience that felt like swallowing glass. Sarah signed Victor's revised prenuptial agreement, accepting his terms with the subdued gratitude of a woman who understood her place. She attended charity luncheons with the proper level of enthusiasm, smiled at gallery openings with the right degree of cultured appreciation, and played the role of the chastened wife who had learned her lesson. Victor, satisfied that he had reasserted control, relaxed his vigilance slightly. The private investigators were dismissed. The constant monitoring of her activities eased. He believed his own narrative that Sarah was too weak and too dependent to seriously challenge his authority. He was wrong, but his arrogance worked in Sarah's favor. Maria's network operated with the efficiency of a military organization. Elena Rodriguez introduced Sarah to Carmen's cousin Diego, who specialized in documentation that would pass casual inspection but couldn't survive serious scrutiny. A new driver's license for Michelle Crawford, complete with a Texas address that existed only on paper. A social security card with a number that belonged to someone who had died in infancy 20 years earlier. Credit cards with minimal limits but legitimate banking relationships. "These will get you started," Diego explained during a meeting in the back room of a laundromat in the Bronx. "But they're not permanent solutions. You'll need to build a real identity eventually, and that takes time and money." Sarah had been systematically moving small amounts of cash from her household allowance accounts. Never enough to trigger the automatic alerts that Victor's accountants had programmed into their financial monitoring systems. $20 here, $50 there, occasional cash back from grocery purchases that she claimed to need for charitable donations. Over 3 weeks, she accumulated nearly $4,000, not enough to live on for long, but sufficient to disappear. The most difficult part was saying goodbye to Maria without actually saying goodbye. Victor's housekeeper had become more than an ally. She was the closest thing to family Sarah had found since leaving Texas. But any dramatic farewell might be remembered later, might provide clues about Sarah's intentions or destination. Instead, on the morning of her planned departure, Sarah simply hugged Maria a little longer than usual and said, "Thank you for everything, for showing me who I really am." Maria's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she simply nodded and replied, "Take care of yourself, mija, and remember, you're stronger than you know." The escape itself was almost anticlimactic. Sarah left the penthouse at her usual time for a charity board meeting, carrying nothing but her purse and wearing clothes that could pass for casual or professional, depending on the situation. She took the subway to Grand Central, where she entered the women's restroom as Sarah Sterling and emerged as Michelle Crawford. The transformation was simple but effective. Her wedding ring went into a trash can. Her designer handbag was replaced with a generic backpack purchased from a convenience store, and her hair was dyed from blonde to brown using a box-color kit that cost less than what she usually spent on coffee. Contact lenses changed her eye color from blue to green. She bought a bus ticket to Dallas, not because she intended to stay there, but because anyone looking for her would assume she was returning to familiar territory. The 12-hour journey gave her time to think, to plan, and to mourn the life she was leaving behind. Not the marriage. That had been a beautiful prison she was finally escaping. But the small freedoms she had carved out, her friendship with Maria, the brief sense of belonging she had found at Jake's joint, the moments when she had remembered what it felt like to be useful rather than ornamental. Dallas was a way station, not a destination. Sarah spent 2 days there, buying clothes at thrift stores, researching cities where she might build a new life, and gradually adjusting to the reality of her situation. She was free, but freedom came with a price. She was also completely alone. With limited resources and no safety net beyond her own determination, she chose Portland, Oregon, partly because it was far from New York, and partly because its food scene was known for valuing authenticity over pretension. If she was going to rebuild her life, she would do it in a kitchen, using the skills she had learned at Mima's diner and refined during her brief time with Jake. The bus to Portland took another 2 days, carrying her across a country she had barely seen despite living in it for 32 years. The landscape outside the window changed from urban sprawl to farmland to mountains. each mile putting more distance between Michelle Crawford and the woman who had once been Sarah Sterling. Portland welcomed her with the casual acceptance of a city accustomed to refugees from more expensive places. She found a studio apartment in a neighborhood that was transitioning from industrial to artistic, paid 3 months' rent in advance with cash, and began the slow process of building an identity from nothing. Her first job was washing dishes at a family-owned restaurant called Mama Rosa's, an Italian-American place that served generous portions to working-class families. The owner, an elderly woman whose husband had died the previous year, was grateful for help and didn't ask too many questions about Michelle's thin resume or reluctance to provide references. "You work hard, you're honest. That's all I need to know," Rosa Benedetto said on Sarah's first day. "The rest, we figure out as we go." Working in Rosa's kitchen was like stepping back in time to her grandmother's diner. The food was simple but well-made. The staff treated each other like family, and the customers were people who worked hard for their money and expected value in return. Sarah started on dish duty but gradually worked her way up to prep, then to the line during busy periods. For the first time in years, she felt like she was contributing to something meaningful, feeding people who needed good food at reasonable prices, working alongside others who understood the dignity of honest labor. The work was physically demanding and the pay was minimal, but Sarah felt more satisfied at the end of a shift than she had during entire years of charity galas and society luncheons. 3 months into her new life, Sarah was beginning to believe she might actually succeed in staying disappeared when Victor's reach caught up with her. The private investigator was young, ambitious, and thorough. He had tracked the cash withdrawals, analyzed security footage from Grand Central, and followed the trail of Michelle Crawford's deliberately thin digital footprint. He found her at Mama Rosa's, photographed her through the kitchen window, and compiled a report that placed Sarah Sterling working as a line cook in a Portland restaurant. The confrontation came not from Victor himself, but from his lawyer, a shark in an expensive suit who appeared at Mama Rosa's during the lunch rush with legal papers and barely concealed contempt. "Mrs. Sterling," he announced loudly enough for the entire dining room to hear, "you're in violation of a court order requiring you to return to New York immediately." The papers were fabricated. Victor had no legal authority to compel Sarah's return, but they looked official enough to convince Rosa and her staff that their new employee was some kind of fugitive. The scene that followed was exactly what Victor had intended: public humiliation, loss of employment, and the destruction of the new life Sarah had been building. "I'm sorry," Rosa said after the lawyer left, her voice full of genuine regret. "I can't have legal troubles in my restaurant. I got grandchildren. You understand I can't take the risk." Sarah understood. She also understood that Victor would continue to destroy any life she tried to build as long as she remained Michelle Crawford. The false identity that had enabled her escape had become a liability, a paper trail that Victor's resources could follow anywhere she went. That night, alone in her studio apartment, with termination papers and eviction notices, Sarah realized that disappearing hadn't been enough. To truly escape Victor's reach, she would need to do more than hide. She would need to become someone he couldn't touch, someone with her own power and resources. She would need to stop running and start fighting back. But first, she would need to learn how to fight in his world, using his weapons, by his rules. The war was about to begin in earnest. 6 months after fleeing New York, Sarah found herself in Austin, Texas, working under the name Michelle Santos at a food truck called Honest Eats that parked outside construction sites and office buildings during lunch hours. The owner, a former line cook named Carlos, had hired her without asking too many questions after she demonstrated that she could prep 50 breakfast tacos in under an hour while managing 3 different protein stations. Austin's food scene was democratic in a way that New York's had never been. Success was measured by the length of the lunch line, not by the designer clothes of the clientele. Food trucks competed with brick-and-mortar restaurants on equal terms, and a good taco from a converted Airstream trailer could generate more buzz than a 20-course tasting menu at a celebrity chef's establishment. Working at Honest Eats reconnected Sarah with the fundamentals she had learned at Mima's Diner: speed, consistency, and the ability to feed hungry people efficiently without sacrificing quality. The breakfast tacos that made the truck famous were deceptively simple: eggs, cheese, and various proteins wrapped in fresh tortillas, but each component required skill to execute properly. The secret, Carlos explained during Sarah's first week, is treating every ingredient with respect. Good eggs, good cheese, fresh tortillas made every morning. People can taste the difference between food made with care and food made just to make money. Sarah threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised her coworkers. She arrived early to help with prep, stayed late to clean the truck, and spent her days off experimenting with new recipes that might expand their menu. The physical exhaustion was welcome after months of anxiety and uncertainty. More importantly, she was learning skills that Victor's money couldn't buy or destroy. Every day, she became more proficient at managing inventory, calculating food costs, understanding the logistics of mobile food service. These were practical skills that belonged to her completely, knowledge that existed independently of any legal document or financial arrangement. The breakthrough came when Carlos allowed her to create a weekly special. Sarah developed a fusion dish that combined her grandmother's chicken and dumplings with Texas barbacoa techniques, creating something that was both familiar and innovative. The Mima's Barbacoa Bowl became the truck's most popular item, generating lines that wrapped around city blocks and social media buzz that attracted food bloggers from Dallas and Houston. "You got something special," Carlos told her after a particularly busy lunch service that had sold out 2 hours early. "You understand food in a way that can't be taught. That's rare." Success at the food truck led to opportunities Sarah hadn't expected. A local restaurant owner offered her a sous chef position. A catering company wanted to license her barbacoa recipe. Food and Wine magazine sent a photographer to document Austin's food truck scene and featured Honest Eats in a prominent spread. But with visibility came vulnerability. Sarah knew that every magazine article, every social media mention, every food blog review increased the chances that Victor's investigators would find her trail. She was building exactly the kind of public profile that made hiding impossible. The decision crystallized when she received an invitation to compete in a televised cooking competition called Kitchen Warriors, a nationally broadcast show where professional chefs competed for a $100,000 prize and the kind of career exposure that could launch restaurants and cookbook deals. Sarah's first instinct was to decline. Television meant cameras, background checks, national exposure. It meant abandoning any pretense of remaining hidden and directly challenging Victor's assumption that she would spend the rest of her life running. But declining also meant accepting that her life would always be constrained by fear of discovery. It meant allowing Victor to dictate the boundaries of her existence, even when he didn't know where she was. The invitation forced Sarah to confront a fundamental question. Did she want to spend the rest of her life hiding from Victor? Or did she want to become strong enough to face him? She called Elena Rodriguez from a payphone outside a gas station on the outskirts of Austin, using a number she had memorized but never written down. "I need advice," Sarah said when Elena answered. "Michelle, is that you? It's Sarah, and I think I'm done running." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour and covered strategies Sarah hadn't previously considered. Elena had helped other women in similar situations, women whose abusers had the resources to track them anywhere they went. "Sometime," she explained, "the only solution was to become untouchable rather than invisible." "You can't hide forever from someone with his money and connections," Elena said, "but you can become someone he can't destroy without destroying himself. You need to build your own power base, your own connections, your own public platform. Make yourself too visible and too valuable for him to attack directly." The strategy was risky but logical. Instead of avoiding publicity, Sarah would court it. Instead of hiding her talents, she would showcase them nationally. Instead of remaining vulnerable because she was alone, she would build a network of professional relationships that existed independently of Victor's influence. Kitchen Warriors would be her coming out party, her declaration that Sarah Sterling was dead and Michelle Santos was very much alive. She accepted the invitation. The show was filmed in Los Angeles over 2 weeks, bringing together 20 professional chefs from across the country for a series of elimination challenges that tested everything from knife skills to creativity under pressure. The format was brutal. One chef eliminated each episode until only the winner remained. Sarah's strategy was to remain competent but not dominant during the early rounds, avoiding the kind of dramatic personality clashes that made for good television but also painted targets on contestants' backs. She cooked consistently well without standing out, building relationships with other competitors while studying their techniques and weaknesses. The turning point came during week 2, when the challenge required contestants to create a dish that represented their personal story. While other chefs prepared elaborate presentations of molecular gastronomy or internationally inspired fusion cuisine, Sarah made a simple but perfect version of her grandmother's chicken and dumplings. "This is the dish that taught me what food could be," she told the judges, her voice steady despite the cameras and studio lights. "It's not fancy, but it's honest. It's made with love and meant to comfort people who work hard and deserve something good at the end of a difficult day." The judges, including a James Beard Award winner and a Michelin-starred chef from San Francisco, tasted the dish in thoughtful silence. Sarah watched their faces, trying to read their reactions, knowing that this moment would determine whether her gamble had succeeded or failed. "This is exceptional," the lead judge finally said. "It's technically perfect. The pasta has exactly the right texture, the broth is beautifully balanced, the chicken is moist and flavorful. But more than that, it has something we rarely see in competition cooking, Soul. This isn't just food, it's a story, and it's a story we want to hear more of." Sarah won that challenge and three more, advancing to the finale as one of the two remaining contestants. The final episode would be broadcast live, with the winner determined by a combination of judges' scores and viewer voting. She had done exactly what Elena suggested, built a platform that Victor couldn't destroy without massive public attention. Win or lose, Sarah would emerge from the competition with a national profile, industry connections, and most importantly, a new identity that existed completely independently of her former life. The night before the finale, she called Maria from her hotel room in Los Angeles. "Mija," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've been watching every episode. You're magnificent. Is he watching too?" "Oh yes, he's watching. And he's not happy." Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. Victor's unhappiness meant she was winning, even if she lost the competition. She had done what he thought was impossible. She had rebuilt her life without his permission and beyond his control. Tomorrow she would cook for her freedom. Win or lose, she would never be Sarah Sterling again. The Kitchen Warriors finale was broadcast live from a studio in Culver City with an audience that included industry professionals, food media, and families of the contestants. Sarah stood at her cooking station, trying to calm her nerves as the show's host explained the final challenge to viewers across the country. "Our two remaining chefs have 90 minutes to create a three-course meal that showcases their culinary point of view," the host announced. "The winner will receive $100,000, a feature in Food and Wine magazine, and a consulting deal with the Apex Restaurant Group worth $500,000. Sarah's opponent was Marcus Chen, a technically brilliant chef from a molecular gastronomy restaurant in Chicago. He was younger, classically trained, and comfortable with the kind of avant-garde techniques that impress judges and camera crews. On paper, he should have been the clear favorite, but Sarah had advantages that weren't visible to the viewing audience. She had learned to cook under pressure in commercial kitchens, where mistakes meant lost income and disappointed customers. She understood food costs, timing, and the practical realities of feeding people efficiently. Most importantly, she had something to prove that went far beyond a television competition. The first course was an appetizer that would set the tone for the entire meal. Marcus immediately began working on a complex preparation involving liquid nitrogen and molecular spherification, creating what looked more like a chemistry experiment than food. Sarah kept it simple, fresh Gulf shrimp with a remoulade sauce based on her grandmother's recipe, served with cornbread made from scratch. "Tell us about your approach," one of the judges asked during a mid-cooking interview. "I'm cooking the food I believe in," Sarah replied, not looking up from her prep work. "Real food, made with good ingredients, meant to nourish people rather than impress them. That's always been my philosophy." The second course was the main event, the dish that would likely determine the winner. Marcus was preparing lamb with multiple components: a foam, a reduction, microgreens arranged with tweezers. Sarah was making short ribs braised in a sauce that combined Texas barbecue techniques with French mother sauces, served with her own version of mac and cheese that elevated comfort food without abandoning its soul. With 30 minutes remaining, disaster struck Marcus's station. His molecular spherification machine malfunctioned, leaving him without his planned garnish for the appetizer. Sarah watched him panic, trying to improvise a replacement while his carefully timed sequence fell apart. Sarah could have focused entirely on her own cooking, but something compelled her to make a different choice: During a brief break between courses, she approached Marcus with a small container of microgreens from her station. "You need a garnish," she said simply. "Use these." Marcus stared at her, confused by the gesture. In his world of competitive fine dining, other chefs were enemies to be defeated, not colleagues to be helped. "Why?" he asked. "Because this is about cooking, not about winning," Sarah replied. "And good cooks help each other." The exchange was captured by the cameras and would later be cited as one of the most genuinely moving moments in the show's history. But Sarah wasn't thinking about television drama. She was thinking about the lessons she had learned at Mima's Diner, where the kitchen staff worked as a team because everyone understood that their success depended on collective effort rather than individual glory. The final 30 minutes passed in a blur of plating, tasting, and last-minute adjustments. Sarah's three courses represented her entire culinary journey: the shrimp appetizer honoring her Louisiana roots, the short ribs showcasing techniques learned in professional kitchens, and a dessert that reinterpreted her grandmother's peach cobbler using modern pastry methods. Marcus's dishes were technically impressive and visually stunning, but they felt cold and calculated. Sarah's plates were simpler but warmer, food that invited tasting rather than demanded admiration. The judging seemed to last forever. Sarah watched the panel of experts taste both meals, their faces revealing nothing about their preferences. She thought about Mima, about Jake, about Maria, about all the people who had taught her that cooking was about more than technique or creativity. It was about connecting with other human beings through the most basic and essential of shared experiences. "The winner of Kitchen Warriors," the host finally announced, his voice building dramatic tension, "by a unanimous decision of our panel of judges, Michelle Santos." The studio erupted in applause. Sarah felt her knees buckle with relief and emotion, tears streaming down her face as she was embraced by Marcus, the judges, and the show's production team. She had won not just the competition, but something far more valuable: proof that she could succeed on her own terms, using skills that belonged entirely to her. The victory interview was brief but poignant. When asked about her plans for the prize money and consulting deal, Sarah's answer was immediate and certain. "I'm going to open a restaurant," she said. "Not a fancy place, not a destination restaurant for food tourists. A neighborhood place that serves real food to real people at prices they can afford. The kind of place where families can celebrate special occasions and working people can get a good meal after a hard day." The interviewer pressed for more details about her background, clearly sensing that there was more to Michelle Santos's story than had been revealed during the competition. Sarah deflected smoothly, keeping the focus on her future plans rather than her past experiences. But she knew that the attention generated by her television victory would make continued anonymity impossible. Victor would see the show. She was certain of that. He would recognize his former wife despite the changed hair and eye color, despite the new name and carefully constructed background story. The question was what he would do about it. The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days after the finale aired, while Sarah was still fielding congratulatory calls and interview requests, a familiar figure appeared at the coffee shop where she was meeting with potential investors for her planned restaurant. Rebecca Sterling looked older than Sarah remembered, her face bearing the pinched expression of someone who had spent years cultivating grievances. She slid into the booth across from Sarah without invitation, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Hello, sister-in-law," Rebecca said. "Or should I call you Michelle now?" Sarah's blood turned to ice, but she kept her voice steady. "I think you have me confused with someone else." "Oh, I don't think so. You're a little thinner, and the hair color's different, but you're definitely my brother's missing wife, the one who abandoned her marriage and stole from the family accounts before disappearing." The accusations were lies, but they were delivered loudly enough for other customers to hear. Sarah realized that this was Victor's opening move in a new kind of warfare: public character assassination designed to destroy her credibility and newfound success. "Victor wants to talk," Rebecca continued. "He has a proposition that might interest you. Something about putting this whole misunderstanding behind us and moving forward as a family." Sarah stood up from the table, gathering her papers and handbag with calm deliberation. She had spent 2 years running from the Sterling family's manipulation and control. She was done running. "Tell Victor," she said clearly, "that Michelle Santos doesn't negotiate with terrorists, and if he wants to have this conversation, He can have it publicly, in front of cameras, where everyone can see exactly what kind of man he really is. Rebecca's confident smirk faltered slightly. This wasn't the terrified, submissive woman who had once signed whatever papers were put in front of her. "You can't hide forever," Rebecca said. "We'll destroy you, just like we destroyed everything else you tried to build." "Then you'll do it in the spotlight," Sarah replied. "Because I'm done hiding, and I'm done being afraid of bullies who think money makes them untouchable." She walked out of the coffee shop knowing that the real war was just beginning, but for the first time since leaving New York, she felt ready for the fight. 18 months after winning Kitchen Warriors, Sarah stood in the kitchen of her restaurant, Mima's Table, during the busiest service they had ever experienced. The converted warehouse in Austin's East Side had become the most difficult reservation in Texas. With a waiting list that stretched 3 months into the future, the success had been built methodically, one satisfied customer at a time. Sarah had used her prize money and consulting fee to secure the location and hire a small but skilled staff. She had insisted on keeping prices reasonable despite the demand, believing that good food should be accessible to working families, not just wealthy food tourists. The menu reflected her entire culinary journey, elevated versions of diner classics alongside innovative dishes that showcased seasonal Texas ingredients. The signature item remained her interpretation of chicken and dumplings, now featuring heritage breed chicken, house-made pasta, and a broth that took 2 days to prepare properly. Food critics had noticed. James Beard Award voters had noticed. And, most importantly for Sarah's long-term security, Michelin inspectors had noticed. The anonymous review process had taken 6 months, with several suspected inspectors dining at Mima's Table during that period. Sarah had trained her staff to treat every customer with the same level of attention and care, knowing that exceptional service couldn't be turned on and off for special occasions. "Chef Santos," her sous chef called from the pass, "there's someone here to see you. Says it's about the Michelin announcement." Sarah's heart rate spiked, but she finished plating the orders in front of her before walking to the dining room. A woman in a tailored suit stood near the host station, holding an envelope that bore the distinctive red Michelin logo. "Ms. Santos, I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Michelin Guide North America. I have some news to share with you." The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with the Michelin logo and a brief message. "Congratulations. Mima's Table has been awarded 1 Michelin star for exceptional cuisine that merits a special journey." Sarah read the words 3 times before they fully registered. A Michelin star, the highest recognition in professional cooking, awarded to fewer than 3,000 restaurants worldwide. She had achieved something that most chefs spend entire careers pursuing. The celebration that night was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Her staff gathered in the dining room after service, sharing champagne and tears of joy. Carlos from Honest Eats drove over from his truck to congratulate her. Elena Rodriguez flew in from New York, bringing with her a group of women from the support network who had followed Sarah's journey with pride and amazement. "You did more than escape," Elena told her during a quiet moment. "You showed every woman in our program that it's possible to rebuild a life that's bigger and better than what you left behind." The media attention was immediate and intense. Food and Wine featured Sarah on their cover with the headline, "From Nowhere to Everywhere, the Michelle Santos Story." The Today Show wanted an interview. Netflix approached about a documentary series. But the call Sarah had been expecting came the next morning, from a number she recognized despite not having seen it in over 2 years. "Congratulations." Victor's voice was as smooth and controlled as ever. "A Michelin star. Very impressive for a diner waitress from East Texas." "Thank you," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "Though I think you have me confused with someone else. My name is Michelle Santos, and I'm a chef." "Of course you are. I suppose we should meet to discuss the situation." "What situation would that be?" "The situation where my estranged wife, who abandoned our marriage and violated numerous legal agreements, is now operating a business under an assumed identity while claiming credit for recipes that may constitute marital property." The threat was clear but carefully worded. Victor was suggesting that he had legal claims to Sarah's recipes, her restaurant, perhaps even her new identity. It was the same pattern of control through intimidation that had defined their marriage. But Sarah was no longer the frightened woman who had once signed his papers without reading them. "That's an interesting theory," she said. "I'd be curious to see you argue it in court. in front of judges who might wonder why a billionaire tech mogul is trying to steal credit for restaurant recipes developed by a woman he claims abandoned him. The long pause that followed told Sarah that Victor hadn't expected this level of resistance. He was accustomed to winning through intimidation and superior resources, not through public legal battles that might expose his behavior to scrutiny. "I think you'll find that fighting me is more expensive than you can afford," he said finally. "Maybe, but I think you'll find that I'm not fighting alone anymore." The support came from unexpected directions. Marcus Chen, her competitor from Kitchen Warriors, organized a group of celebrity chefs who publicly endorsed Sarah's work and condemned any attempts to intimidate successful women in the industry. The James Beard Foundation issued a statement supporting culinary artists' rights to their creative work. Food and Wine offered to cover her legal expenses as part of an investigative series about abuse in the restaurant industry. Most importantly, Sarah's own success had given her the resources to hire competent legal representation. The lawyer she retained specialized in cases involving domestic abuse and financial intimidation, and had experience dealing with wealthy men who used the legal system as a weapon against their former partners. "The beautiful thing about your situation," attorney Jessica Chen explained during their first meeting, "is that you've created something genuinely valuable that exists completely independently of your former marriage, your recipes, your reputation, your restaurant. None of that can be traced back to anything Victor provided or controlled." The legal battle that followed was brief but decisive. Victor's claims crumbled under scrutiny when Sarah's legal team produced documentation showing that all of her restaurant's signature dishes were based on family recipes that predated her marriage, combined with techniques she had learned through her own training and experience. More damaging to Victor's case was the testimony of Maria Santos, who had kept detailed records of his controlling behavior throughout their marriage. The housekeeper's meticulous documentation painted a picture of systematic emotional abuse that made Victor's current legal harassment look like a continuation of established patterns rather than legitimate business disputes. The turning point came when Rebecca Sterling, apparently tired of being used as her brother's proxy in his personal vendettas, agreed to testify about the fabricated evidence Victor had used to threaten Sarah years earlier. Her testimony revealed the calculated nature of his manipulation and destroyed any remaining credibility his legal claims might have had. Victor withdrew his lawsuit 3 weeks after filing it, but not before the case had generated exactly the kind of public attention Sarah had predicted. Business publications covered the story as an example of how wealthy men use legal intimidation to control former partners. Women's advocacy groups held Sarah up as an example of successful resistance to financial abuse. Most importantly for Sarah's long-term security, the publicity had made her too visible and too valuable for Victor to attack without serious consequences. She was no longer an isolated woman he could intimidate privately. She was a public figure with her own platform, her own resources, and her own network of professional relationships. 6 months after receiving her Michelin star, Sarah opened a second location of Mima's Table in Dallas, followed by a third in Houston. She published a cookbook that became a New York Times bestseller, with proceeds donated to organizations that helped women escape abusive relationships. The restaurants were profitable, but more importantly, they were fulfilling Sarah's original vision: neighborhood places where working families could afford to celebrate special occasions and where good food was served with dignity and respect. Standing in her Austin kitchen on a busy Saturday night, watching her staff work with the precision and pride of professionals who believed in what they were doing, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had lost everything: her marriage, her financial security, her social position, even her name, only to discover that everything she had lost had been preventing her from building something infinitely more valuable. The golden cage had been beautiful, but it had also been a prison. Freedom had required her to give up the illusion of security in exchange for the reality of independence. The final vindication came in the form of a handwritten letter that arrived at the restaurant on a Tuesday in March, exactly 5 years after she had first walked into Mima's diner as a 17-year-old girl whose parents had just died in a car accident. The letter was from Jake Morrison, the chef whose underground restaurant had first shown her what it meant to cook with purpose and integrity. He was opening a new place in Brooklyn and wanted to know if she might be interested in consulting on the menu. "I was wrong about you," the letter said. "You weren't playing at being a chef. You were learning to become one." What you've built in Texas is exactly what I was trying to create in Queens. Real food for real people, made with skill and served with respect. I'd be honored to work with you. Sarah smiled as she read the words, remembering the young woman who had once been so desperate for validation that she would have signed any document, accepted any humiliation, just to avoid being alone. That woman had been brave enough to leave everything she knew, but she hadn't understood that leaving was only the beginning. The real courage had come later, the courage to build something new rather than simply run from something old. The courage to compete publicly rather than hide privately. The courage to risk everything she had rebuilt for the chance to claim the life she actually wanted to live. She picked up a pen and began writing her response to Jake's invitation. There was still work to do, still women who needed to know that escape was possible, still battles to be fought against people who believed that money gave them the right to control other human beings. But tonight, in her kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of honest work and the smells of good food, Sarah Santos was exactly where she belonged. She was home, in a place she had built with her own hands, serving food that nourished both body and soul to people who understood its value. The girl from the trailer park had become a woman with a Michelin star, but more importantly, she had become someone who knew her own worth and refused to let anyone else define it for her. The golden cage was broken, and she was finally free. The end. This story reminds us that our true worth isn't determined by what others think of us, but by what we choose to build with our own hands and hearts. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what we're actually capable of achieving. If Sarah's journey from humiliation to triumph inspired you, please share this story with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, it's never too late to break free from the cages that others build around us, no matter how beautiful they might appear.